Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next lecture, Reconstructing Women's Lives, Women During and After the Civil War. The Civil War is perhaps the central event in American history, more revolutionary even than the American Revolution. Why? Because the Civil War really establishes the essential permanence of the nation as a constitutional and legal and cultural entity, as opposed to what had been the primary frame of reference for many Americans before the Civil War, namely their respective states. So, in some basic way, the concept of nationalism is going to triumph over localism as a result of this Civil War. But even more revolutionary, I think, is the war's destruction of slavery. Remember, slavery had been a central institution in the development of America and America's economy from the early colonial period. So, over 2 centuries of enslavement in America had been central to the basic economic development of the country from the colonial era forward. But it is the Civil War that will see now the destruction of slavery, even though, as we are reminded, that the war was not initiated for the purpose of abolishing slavery, but rather to entreat the South to end its rebellion against the federal government. Lincoln, in his first inaugural, for example, professed no interest in trying to abolish slavery or encroach upon the rights of slave owners, which he felt were constitutionally protected. But the course of the war itself, and you can see the map here showing in sort of chromatic terms the division of the nation between the North and the South, a largely non-slaveholding North and a slaveholding South. The actual course of the war itself ultimately determined that the character of the Civil War would be indeed to confront the issue of slavery head on and ultimately to see its abolition. So, in that sense, the geography of division had its own inexorable logic, and that logic being that one way or another, slavery would be confronted during the course of the war, and depending on the outcome of that conflict, would either be abolished in the event of a Northern victory, that is, a federal victory, or perhaps maintained in the event of a Confederate victory. Well, I hope I'm not ruining the surprise for you when I tell you that in fact it was the federal or Union victory in 1865 that ensured the demise of slavery. And so before we launch into the discussion of women's lives in the Civil War, let's take a look at the legacy of the war itself. It's one of those unfortunate facts that the very popularity of Civil War history has gone a long way toward in the popularizing of the event, toward romanticizing and mythologizing the event. And we often treat the Civil War as if it was a kind of romance between 2 sections of the nation, both honorable, both laudatory. Even the military conquest is sometimes depicted in sort of honorable terms as men of principle on both sides fought for what they thought were their promised liberties. Well, I have one word to say to all of that, and it is balderdash. Go ahead and look that one up in the dictionary if you want to. Balderdash. Instead, I'll let this Matthew Brady photograph remind us what the Civil War was really about. As you see the ruins of Charleston, South Carolina, and read the dispatch, the Richmond Daily Dispatch excerpt here from 1865. a country where the devastations of war and the exhausting exertions of defense against overwhelming odds had reduced the people nearly to famine. Nothing romantic about this. Nothing romantic, nothing particularly honorable about the destruction of American cities, of the slaughtering of American people by their fellow Americans. But counted among the legacy or legacies of the Civil War, as I mentioned, the end of slavery, a kind of national reach. The war was fought in over 10,000 places, both north and south. 3 million soldiers fighting, Americans all fighting for what each side saw as its rightful claim to legitimacy, the Union or federal cause to preserve the Constitution and the nation, the Confederate or Southern cause to secede from the Union and declare the independence of Southern slaveholding states. When it was over, nearly 700,000 deaths, much of the South in ruins, and along the way, the war became a kind of catalyst for the Industrial Revolution and the growth of new industries, everything from railroads to steel making, not to mention the blueprint for what would become big government in this country, as both sides, particularly the Union side, the federal government, had to create a command and control structure throughout the war that would make, among other things, new government agencies and the need for organization and logistics part of a growing federal bureaucracy in Washington. Another legacy of the Civil War was that it inspires what I mentioned a minute ago, a kind of mythology of the Old South. And we'll talk a bit about that as we go along. We've already mentioned the Gone with the Wind imagery of slavery. But here we'll see that it's the reinvention of Civil War history, the reimagination of Civil War history, and the basic forgetting of the actual conditions of the war and the causes of the war that will lead to the romanticization and mythology of both the Old South and slaveholding and even the war itself. And just as a reminder, that mythologizing is still playing itself out today, as we see, for example, in certain parts of the country, including New Orleans, Louisiana, a recent decision to take down certain Confederate statues or efforts to remove the Confederate flag from southern state houses. This is very much an issue that lives on in the minds and memories of contemporary Americans, pretty far removed from the original causes and historical fact of the war, I would say, but instead having become part of our own contemporary culture wars. So powerful imagery, powerful symbols, all of them still playing their part divisively in the America of our own time. So we could count that among the legacies of the Civil War as well. Our bleeding, bankrupt, almost dying nation was how New York newspaper publisher Horace Greeley referred to America at the end of the Civil War. And you see here a photograph of Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital and capital of Virginia, in ruins by the end of the Civil War. Nothing, again, particularly romantic about this. Americans slaughtering Americans on American soil. So, once again, peeling back layers of mythology and romance to see the historical event on its own terms based on the evidence that it produced. One of the things that the war produced was what one contemporary called a republic of suffering. When you have 700,000 dead, just to put that in perspective, 700,000 Americans dead in the Civil War, that's more Americans dying than in all of our other wars combined, including the world wars of the 20th century. And because of the advent of photography and modern newspaper reporting, Americans of the time were very close to the action, saw images of destruction and death on the battlefield, not to mention the hastily dug graves, in this case, of Confederate soldiers just outside of Richmond, Virginia. Not even enough time to erect proper headstones, but temporary graves a short distance from the battlefield. It will be in the decades that follow, of course, that great efforts are undertaken to create proper cemeteries and proper memorials to signify the loss of these Americans, including the erection of statues to call memory to the lives of the great men, the great military leaders, for example, of both sides, and those memorials and those statues are still to be found today. Although, as I say, at least in the case of New Orleans, Louisiana, by edict of local government, some of them have been removed. A friend of mine suggested, in fact, that the removal of those statues was the same as the Taliban's destruction of the great and giant Buddha statues in Afghanistan. And look, nobody, when you're sitting around having a good time, nobody necessarily needs a history lecture. So I didn't bother to go into the whys and wherefores of it, but I would argue strenuously that the decision to remove Confederate soldier statues in the South today is not the same as the destruction of ancient monuments such as the Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan by the Taliban. The Taliban are creating a zealous and sort of ultra restrictive theocracy based on the exclusive claims of their faith in Afghanistan. The Confederate statues of the South were erected years after the Civil War by those who wished uh, to retake the memory of the war, if you will, as a noble cause, a lost cause, but a noble cause for something called states' rights, not recognizing, of course, that the real purpose of those statues was the claim ultimately of racial supremacy and white racial supremacy in the South by the generations who followed the Civil War. As if having lost the Civil War, having seen slavery abolished, the post war South could reclaim at least white supremacy and racial rule, as we'll see later in this lecture, by erecting statues to the men who fought on behalf of the Confederacy. Well, that's a divisive and often emotional argument, but as a historian, for me, it is a fairly clear cut case of memorializing a fictional memory of the Civil War. When you look at the evidence, what you see is not nobility and romance. What you see is death and destruction, a whole landscape littered by war. Again, a Matthew Brady photograph showing the Confederate dead after the Battle of Antietam in Maryland in 1862. These happened to be Southern troops who fell during that single day of fighting. The single bloodiest day of the Civil War, in fact, was the Battle of Antietam in 1862. These photographs brought a realism to the event that Americans at the time, became very familiar with. More than 1 million photographs were taken, often showing the after effects of battle, including corpses such as these. Due to the limitations of photography, it was necessary to set up cameras that could have a good 2 or 3 minute exposure time. Anything that would move within the frame would be blurred or lost in the resulting image. So, what more cooperative subjects than the fallen soldiers whose corpses lay across the battlefields making them fit subjects for the photographer. Brady, the photographer in this case, actually ran an exhibit of Civil War photographs in his Broadway, New York photo studio, and people lined up to see what no generation had ever seen. That is, the photographic evidence of war's deadly toll, which went a long way toward disabusing people of the sort of wartime romances of literature that were popular, the sort of tales of knights in shining armor and that sort of thing, but instead showed the bloated and bloodied and mangled corpses of Americans laying in American soil. It would be future generations, farther removed from these photographs, who would, in their own memories, memorialize the Civil War as something noble, something principled, worthy of statues. And in this catastrophic event, women are deeply involved. No surprise, based on our study so far, to find women's lives at the center of every great event in America, every great development, including the Civil War. Amanda Aiken, in 1863, we pass up and down among these rough men without fear of the slightest word of disrespect. They feel their dependence upon us for comfort and entertainment, and the difference in the wards where there is no lady shows how much can be done for them. Amanda Aiken was talking about the field hospitals that became almost commonplace now in the Civil War, where soldiers who were wounded or who lay dying were tended to by women volunteers who, on a large scale, will organize some of the first great public health efforts, medical efforts on behalf of Civil War soldiers, including Mary Livermore and the U.S. Sanitary Commission, one of the first large scale public health efforts organized by Livermore and others to provide relief efforts during the war, as I say, in soldiers' hospitals, but also to create campaigns among the public for clean linens and bandages and other supplies that could be used in the support of the Union Army cause. Clara Barton famously was part of the American Red Cross, an organization that had followed the International Red Cross's organization a decade earlier, to, in effect, again, provide basic and needed medical help to wounded veterans and soldiers from the battlefields to the hospitals, and a kind of full-time professionalizing, you might say, of nursing. Clara Barton is really instrumental in taking nursing from a kind of, amateur status to now a formal professional standing that required standards of education and training, etc., where many women will find their first professional experiences outside the home. So the Civil War is a catalyst on many fronts, including those organized by women during the war. The duties of a lady, part of what American women faced during the war, women like Amanda Aiken, was questioning the gender boundaries and whether it was even ladylike to be among these men of war. It seemed to me this evening as I sat at my table, adding to the list of medicines, writing down name, regiment, list of clothing, etc., of the new arrivals, calmly looking at the poor, maimed sufferers carried by, some without limbs on a stretcher, that had forgotten how to feel. It seemed as if I were entirely separated from the world I had left behind. There is Amanda Aiken's diary entry from 1863 showing that the experience of a woman in wartime was greatly removed from the domestic sphere of everyday civilian life. Nurses worked to make their wards more cheerful and to provide special entertainments. At Armory Square, Aiken noted, Ward F was decorated with flags, evergreens, and hanging baskets of flowers for the hospital's first anniversary, similar to the picture you see here. Enslaved women during the war found their own opportunities. Early in the war, the Union Army declared that any slaves escaping from their plantations would be defined as contraband of war, that is, formerly confiscated property belonging to the enemy, in this case the Confederate slave owners. And it was this legal definition or wartime definition of escaping slaves as contraband that allowed the Union Army first and then the Congress to declare them now free, as in effect the war dictated the new terms of their status. Harriet Jacobs, who you see here on the right, uh, escaped slavery in 1849 by hiding out in the home of a sympathetic white person, living in the attic of her home until finally, during the Civil War, she was able to freely emancipate herself and to write of her life story in a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So, men and women and children alike, in some instances, were able to find freedom by, in effect, voting with their feet. That is, escaping during the war, finding refuge behind Union Army lines, and laying claim now to their essentially free status, one that was affirmed, a status affirmed first by the U.S. military and then by the Congress of the United States, leading famously to Abraham Lincoln's presidential proclamation on January 1st of 1863, the famous Emancipation Proclamation. Sometimes Lincoln is credited with freeing the slaves, but as I'm suggesting, that work had already been begun by the slaves themselves, confirmed by the Army, and only belatedly recognized by politicians like President Abraham Lincoln. As Frederick Douglass, himself a former slave who escaped to the North and became one of the leading advocates of abolition, as Frederick Douglass said, "Verily, the work does not end with the abolition of slavery, but only begins." And of course, he was right, because even with the surrender of the Confederacy and the ending of the Civil War in the spring of 1865, the story of the lives of former slaves now in freedom was just beginning. The era we know as the era of Reconstruction. And among the first federal agencies created during Reconstruction and dedicated to civil rights, the first federal agency dedicated to civil rights in American history, known as the Freedmen's Bureau, sought to protect the legal rights of former slaves. And this meant providing for the education of former slaves, providing aid to the poor and the aged, the settling of legal disputes, trying to ensure equal legal treatment for former slaves, the rudiments of health care. One might say the first effort at a health care bill came through the Freedmen's Bureau at the end of the Civil War, supporting what was called a free labor system, giving the rights to former slaves to contract for their own labor as free people, and even advocating the landowning rights of former slaves as well, not to mention parental rights over children. So all of these many and varied causes undertaken by the Freedmen's Bureau, organized formally by the military at the end of the Civil War as a civil rights agency, now the first in American history, dedicated to uplifting the conditions of the former slaves. Keep in mind that before the Civil War, it was against the law in every southern state to teach a slave to read. And Reconstruction afforded the freedmen, as the former slaves were known, the freedmen, for the first time in American history, to attend school and learn to read. And it was among the most cherished rights, that of education, the most cherished rights that the former slaves rushed to embrace. The Freedmen's Bureau trained young black women as teachers to spread literacy in the black communities after the Civil War. And this took on such great importance to the former slaves because, after all, anything that had been denied to them as slaves, they understood perfectly well were things essential to freedom, including education, the right to read, the right to learn mathematics, the three R's, you might say, essential to freedom. To live in America without these skills was to live without real liberty. And so no one needed to prod, no one needed to encourage, no one needed to drag the freedmen to school. They did not complain about their lessons. They did not roll their eyes over what their teachers requested of them because they knew that education was indispensable. And among those who not only were educated, who became educators themselves, were formerly enslaved women. Among the post war Reconstruction amendments, of course, famously the 13th Amendment, the first of the great Civil War Reconstruction amendments, which abolished slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment, which bestowed citizenship on the former slaves in 1868, and the 15th Amendment in 1870, which also bestowed the right to vote to male adults, that is, to the freed men living in the country who had formerly been slaves. This amounted to a revolution in American history, a great experiment, as the historian Eric Foner has put it, in interracial democracy, the likes of which the world had never seen. Think about it. Barely removed from enslavement, an enslavement that had denied them all basic legal and human rights. Now the freed men and women were being given fundamental legal and constitutional rights, and for the freed men at least, the right to vote. For the first time, freed women could claim basic legal rights that had always been denied them under slavery. Wedding licenses and birth certificates issued during Reconstruction, for example, were among two forms of legal identity and certification that gave freed women their first claims of legally recognizable personhood. I'll say that again, legally recognizable personhood. In other words, their identities as human beings were legally validated now, and a degree of legally enforceable authority over their families and family claims that slavery had long denied them. Ironically, the process of Reconstruction in voting rights in particular had created a wedge between white women advocates for voting. Lucy Stone, we resolved to make common cause with the colored class, the only other disenfranchised class, and strike for equal rights for all. Now, Lucy Stone had been an abolitionist who supported the abolition of slavery and who supported the Reconstruction amendments, including the 15th Amendment, that would enfranchise former male slaves. And I emphasize male slaves because there were those supporters of abolition and women's rights now who claimed that Congress had failed in not granting, at the same time the 15th Amendment granted freed men the right to vote, not granting all women the right to vote. Supporters of women's voting rights split in 1869 over differences in strategy and focus. Many had supported abolition of slavery before and during the war and saw the cause of women's emancipation as important as and connected to that of the slaves' emancipation. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, here on the right, broke with their former ally, Lucy Stone, here on the left, when Congress refused to include women in the 15th Amendment. Lucy Stone favored continued political efforts in cooperation with the Reconstruction Congress to find voting rights for women, while Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony chartered an independent course to create an independent movement for women's voting rights. And in doing so, a wedge was also driven between white women and black women in the fight for women's suffrage, particularly as the National Women's Suffrage Association was seen as an organization dedicated primarily to the voting rights of white women. Another failure in the case of land reform also meant that generations of black women in the South would live in a vicious cycle of poverty and indebtedness. The failure of Congress to pass land reform legislation during Reconstruction meant that 40 acres and a mule remained an unfulfilled promise to hundreds of thousands of black Southerners. Instead, sharecropping, a form of debt peonage, became the usual arrangement between black farmers and white landowners, and basically eliminated any real possibility that the freedmen might have of becoming independent landowning citizens. And what this meant was a kind of economic death sentence then for generations of black Southerners who would labor under the onerous terms of sharecropping, find themselves in a violent circle, if you will, of debt and poverty that would keep the hope of economic independence long delayed where black folks were concerned in the United States down to our present time. Reconstruction's end and the rise of an American apartheid, that is, a racial caste system in the segregated South known as Jim Crow, will emerge following on the heels of Reconstruction. The name Jim Crow is often used to describe the segregation laws, rules, and customs that arose after Reconstruction ended in 1877 and continued until the mid 1960s. The term originally stems from Jim Crow, who you see here on the right, an exaggerated, highly racially stereotypical black character in the traveling theater and minstrel shows of the 1830s through the 1870s. This was a comic character, a character who played out, usually by white actors wearing black grease paint, played out outlandish racial stereotypes to the amusement of white audiences. Jim Crow became the label for the system of segregation, what I'm calling the American apartheid or racial caste system that emerged in the segregated South after Reconstruction. All of this was sanctified by the Supreme Court in its famous decision in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, the separate but equal case in which all areas of public life, transportation, restaurants, theaters, restrooms, public schools, and one might add to the list baseball teams, cemeteries, marriage, and in countless ways now a racial line drawn between white and colored, so-called colored because the segregation laws were written to essentially set a boundary among white folks so that even people of mixed race heritage would be left on the outside looking in, the so-called colored population left on the outside looking in. The birth and death of civil rights during Reconstruction and afterwards sees not only the segregation of people in this country by color, but also the disfranchisement and loss of voting rights for black people. Southern white nationalists known as Redeemers began undermining the 15th Amendment as soon as Reconstruction ended in 1876, getting around the constitutional requirement that voting not be denied on the basis of color. These Redeemers wrote state laws that instead required voters to pay a poll tax, pass a literacy test, or prove citizenship prior to the 14th Amendment, the famous grandfather clause. In Williams v. Mississippi, the Supreme Court case in 1898, the court upheld the constitutionality of literacy tests and voter registration requirements passed by the states. Now let's be clear. The reason why southern states passed these voter registration requirements, was not to promote equality. It was to deny black folks the right to a political voice, to deny them the right to vote or to hold elective office. This was white supremacy enshrined now in literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and poll taxes, and it would prove devastating to the political power and independence of black Southerners for many, many decades in this country, allowing white supremacy and white nationalism to hold complete rule over the South with constitutional sanction. And domestic terrorism and racial violence supported this movement away from civil rights. O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name, said one observer of the growing climate of racial violence in the South. Jim Crow and the return to white rule in the South was accompanied with the rise of domestic terrorism and a wave of brutal racial violence known as lynching that would last for decades. Whites who carried out lynching often claimed that the victims, black men, but sometimes also black women, had sexually assaulted or otherwise insulted the honor of white women. Now remember, throughout the time of slavery, white men had routinely sexually assaulted enslaved black women without legal barrier, without punishment. And thus you could say of lynching, the South's hidden history of rape and sexual violence was now simply turned on its head as white mobs used the gendered claim of protecting the honor of white women to justify unspeakable brutality. You see the famous picture here of a Southern lynching in which white people, civilians, men and women, couples, old and young, pose for the photographer under the hanging bodies of two lynching victims. This was no longer part of the secret history of the South, but a deliberately open act, a campaign of domestic terrorism to intimidate and suppress the claims of black people. And without legal recourse, no Southern sheriff would arrest, no Southern jury would convict any white person who might be accused of lynching. Instead, Southerners, white Southerners, depicted this as the most patriotic actions in upholding the honor of white women. You see here how publications played upon the theme that black men were in effect sexual marauders, sexual beasts whose only concern was to rape and violate white women. The title of this comic was even How Sleeps the Beast. And notice in the corner on the fold, the man, Negro, the girl, white, the payoff, lynch. So domestic terrorism tied to a gendered claim of racial sexual assault, entirely invented by redeemers and white supremacists to justify the terrorism and violence of lynching against black Southerners. One woman who stood up courageously, stood up to this terrorism and initiated a crusade against lynching was a Southern born black woman, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was raised in Tennessee. She was the daughter of former slaves who, after seeing her friends lynched by a white mob, left the South, moved to Chicago, and undertook the writing of a great expose known as Southern Horrors. Lynch Law in All Its Phases by Ida Wells was a publication that documented, using mostly Southern white newspaper reports, documented the crimes of lynching. She recounted how the city of Memphis has demonstrated that neither character nor standing avails the Negro if he dares to protect himself against the white man or become his rival. There is nothing we can do about the lynching now, as we are outnumbered and without arms. The white mob could help itself to ammunition without pay, but the order is rigidly enforced against the selling of guns to Negroes. There is therefore only one thing left to do: save our money and leave a town which will neither protect our lives and property nor give us a fair trial in the courts, but takes us out and murders us in cold blood when accused by white persons. The effort of Wells helped inspire the formation of a new organization dedicated to the fighting of American lynching. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, organized in 1909, inspired in part by the work of Ida Wells to expose racial violence and murder. Famously, outside their Manhattan, New York headquarters, the NAACP would mount a black flag with the words, "A man was lynched yesterday," each time a reported lynching came to the headquarters of the NAACP. So frequently was this flag found outside the office, hanging above the streets of New York, that it was a testament to the near universality of lynching, not just for a few years, but for decades in this country, as Congress sat by passively refusing to write national laws making lynching a crime, as local states refused to arrest or prosecute lynchers. This was homegrown American terrorism, as equal in brutality, as equal in violence to almost any kind of terrorism you could imagine. I once had a student who questioned me on this, who said, "Surely I must be exaggerating," and it's an easy enough thing to direct a student to do. If you're interested, simply Google lynching America and see what comes up. Because, as I say, this was never meant to be a secret activity. Lynching was deliberately used as a public action by Southern whites and beyond the South. In fact, here in the West and in the North, by whites who wished to enforce the claims of white supremacy through brutalization and intimidation of black people. All right, so we'll end our lecture for now on reconstructing women's lives and move forward to other facets of American women's history in the lectures.